So here we go with part one. We're going to spend some time first thinking about why reinforcement is important. So thinking about this, we're going to, again, describe why we think we're going to use consequence strategies to increase behavior. So we often hear some questions from teachers about this topic. And you may have some of these questions. You may know people who have some of these questions. So we just want to spend a little bit of time addressing those as we go through. So some teachers might ask, why do I need to acknowledge appropriate behavior in the first place? Why do I need to provide positive reinforcement? Things like, if my content is engaging and related to the students' lives, won't they just behave appropriately in order to learn? If I give students something like a tangible, aren't I bribing them or extrinsically motivating them so that they won't develop intrinsic motivation but will come to expect something for demonstrating what they should be doing in the first place? Shouldn't students just know how to behave? I've already set and taught my expectations, so shouldn't I just expect students to meet those? Should I really use valuable class time to reinforce the expectations after I've taught them? And things like, if my students like me as a person, won't they behave appropriately just to please me? So again, you may have some of these questions. You may know people who have some of these questions, but we want to spend a little bit of time talking through what we know about what positive reinforcement is, how we use it, and how we think about acknowledgements in general. So I'm going to take us back to modules 1 and 2, where we first defined reinforcement and punishment. And thinking about the specific definitions that we're using in this course that are a little bit different than the way we use these words in regular life. So you'll remember that reinforcement occurs when the consequence or the thing that comes after the behavior increases the likelihood that that behavior happens again in the future. That's not about the intention with which we deliver a particular strategy. It's about the actual effect on the future behavior. Punishment is the exact opposite of that. So when the thing that happens or the consequence that happens after a particular behavior decreases the likelihood that that behavior is going to happen again in the future, we call that punishment. Again, not related to the intent with which we deliver a particular strategy. So reinforcement increases the future likelihood of a behavior. Punishment decreases the future likelihood of a behavior. Behavior happens again when it's reinforced. That is, we keep doing things that work for us. And we talked in modules 1 and 2 about the idea of function of behavior. Another way to think about that is just when something's working for us, we keep doing it. And this works for both positive and negative behaviors. So when a student gets something desirable following a behavior, that behavior is strengthened and it's more likely to happen again in the future. So think about this scenario. If a student is removed from the classroom after refusing to do a difficult assignment, that student will likely act up again later when he or she cannot complete the work because they were able to get out of the work the first time. It's working for them. That acting up behavior allows them to get out of a difficult assignment. And so when that happens over time, that acting up behavior gets strengthened and the student continues to engage in that behavior. Same is true on the other side. If a student is given praise, is acknowledged for persisting on a difficult assignment, the student is more likely to persist later on with difficult assignments because they were acknowledged. That effort was acknowledged as they were working on that difficult assignment. So in this case, this particular persistence behavior is working for the student because they're getting some adult attention from that. And so they're more likely to continue to do that again in the future. So we want to make sure we think about function when we think about reinforcements. And when we think about developing a system to acknowledge appropriate behavior, we have to really go back to those behavioral basics that we talked about in modules 1 and 2 and think about what is the function of the student's behavior and how can I help them get that function met in a more socially appropriate way, and how can I make sure that my acknowledgements that I'm providing are actually meeting the function of behavior that the student needs to have met in that particular situation. There are a lot of benefits of acknowledgement systems, but I think one of the most powerful is just simply that it creates positive relationships. And that when we think about developing positive relationships with people, it's about positive interactions. It's about hearing a nice thing from a teacher or a peer, and we tend to spend more time with people who we have more positive interactions with. And so it is a relationship building tool that creates those positive interactions. It also helps to clarify your expectations. So in Module 3, we talked about how to teach expectations in your classroom. Just like when we teach academic content, we want to make sure that we provide students with good instructional feedback, both when they get something wrong, but also when they get something right, so they know exactly what it is that we want them to do again. So yes, that is an example of how we show respect in this classroom, helps to clarify the meaning of respect, and it gives them good instructional feedback. It also increases the likelihood that the desired behaviors will be repeated, because they're going to work for students by letting them know what they're doing right. And providing acknowledgement reduces the need for time-consuming disciplinary measures. All of these proactive strategies are time-saving supports for you as a teacher. Doing these things up front reduces the amount of problem behaviors that you'll have in your classroom and makes it more likely that kids are going to not engage in those, and you will have more time for instruction. We hear a lot of questions about, is this appropriate for older students? So we're going to acknowledge that directly. What we know about adolescents is that they typically have this heightened flight or fight response, and that they often perceive like a neutral interaction as something that's threatening. They're kind of on edge all the time. And that they also need a more intensive experience to recognize it as either reinforcing or punishing. So because of kind of where they're at developmentally, we know that they actually need a more intensive experience to even recognize it as reinforcing. If a neutral interaction might be perceived as threatening, we need to make sure we're being extra sincere and providing even more frequent, more varied, and more meaningful reinforcement to adolescents. Because of kind of where they're at developmentally, we have to make sure we're really increasing those rates. They actually probably need more reinforcement than younger kids, because they aren't going to even pick up on some of the reinforcement that's available in the environment, given where they're at developmentally. When we think about the use of rewards, another question we hear is, are extrinsic rewards detrimental to long-term motivation for learning? And I want to reassure you, first of all, that there is a lot of research that basically says no, that is not the case, that providing tangible rewards or extrinsic reinforcement, when it's done well, does not deter long-term learning for learning's sake, or what we would call intrinsic motivation. There's a lot of research behind that. We'll point you to a couple of resources here. You can learn more at pbis.org as well. But we want you to really think about the fact that we think about how we develop what we'll call intrinsic motivation, and a way we might think about using acknowledgement to help students move along that continuum. So we're going to think less about intrinsic versus extrinsic, and instead think about, how do we develop motivation to do something? You'll remember we talked about these phases of learning back in modules 1 and 2. We start at the acquisition phase, when we're first learning to do something accurately, and we move our way through these phases of learning to a situation where we can use a particular skill in a variety of different situations and in new ways when we get to the generalization side of things. So when you think about how do you get yourself through these different phases, think about learning something new. We tend to be intrinsically motivated, or we tend to come back and practice the things that we're good at, or that we can access natural reinforcement for. So if you are good at athletics, you probably spent more time doing athletics, and you probably gained athletic skill, which made it easier for you to gain reinforcement. You won your games, you got praise from your coach and your teammates, and so you did that some more. When you think about something that's difficult for you, likely the first few times you tried it, you didn't get that access to reinforcement. And so you may have stopped doing that. You may have stopped engaging in that particular activity. And so we want to think about, as we move through these phases of learning, we want to think about, how do we help kids get over that initial hump? When something's difficult, we need an extra boost of reinforcement to help us stick with it. So when we're first learning to do something accurately, or when we're trying to learn to do it more quickly, it's important that somebody's there to say, yeah, keep going, and provide that extra reinforcement. By the time we're already good at something, it's likely that we can access the reinforcement that's available in the environment anyway, and we no longer need somebody to follow us around saying good job. Most of us learn to read by having somebody sit right there with us and say something like, yeah, cat says cat. By the time we're adults, most of us no longer need somebody to say good job. We just pick up our phones, we read the news, we read our emails, because it gives us access to information. And so we're able to access that naturally occurring reinforcement, and we don't need that extra support anymore. Same is true when you're learning a new language. When you're first trying it out, it's difficult. You need a lot of encouragement and support. Once you're able to use it fluently and you can use it in a variety of different situations, you don't need that additional support anymore. Think about this exact same process applying to every social skill that we've learned and that we try to teach to kids. When they're first learning something new or they're learning to do it in a new way, we need to be there to provide really good encouragement to them. Once they're really fluent with the skill, we can back off. So when we think about the question about, do I need to provide reinforcement to my students, it depends on where they're at in this phases of learning. If they're still needing an extra boost, an extra dose of reinforcement to help keep them going, then the answer is yes. If they're able to access naturally reinforcing situations in the environment, then probably we don't need to provide additional reinforcement for them. They will probably continue to engage in those activities as we go forward. A couple of tips for using rewards well. The first thing is to use reward behavior, not people. That is, providing an acknowledgement for somebody is something that's behavior specific, not person specific. So saying, good job completing this task is not the same thing as saying you are a good human being. We want to make sure that all of the students in your classroom can access a certain level of just non-contingent reinforcement. You're glad they're there. You're glad they are there to contribute to your class. And it's not about their particular behavior. They are welcome regardless. But when we talk about a system for acknowledging behavior, we're talking about specific acknowledgments that are tied to specific behaviors. So it's important to clarify the difference between rewarding a good kid and a good behavior, and really focus on the specific behavior, because all of us have days where we engage in more negative behaviors or more positive behaviors, and in both cases we want to make sure we acknowledge the behavior, not the person, because it's not about being a good or a bad person. Think about embedding rewards in the activity or the behaviors that you want to encourage. So an example here, my son and his friend playing their instruments. They had to practice for 20 minutes each day, and we got into this ongoing debate about what 20 minutes meant and how much time he needed to really spend. And so he would sit there with a timer and go really slowly through his music. He would pause, he would drop the papers on the floor, all of those different things. And so we sat down and we said, hey, this isn't going to work. What can we do? And we developed, he said, I just want to get done with my music so I can go play with my friends. Turns out his friend also needed to practice his instrument. And so we said, look, if you can get through a good 20 minutes of practice, and by good, we defined it as if your music teacher was sitting here, would he or she agree that this was a good 20 minutes of practice, then tomorrow you can invite your friend over to play with you. These guys played for 45 minutes, didn't notice the time, played through all of their music, made up some of their own, and this happened on a regular basis. Just by embedding the reward, time with his friend, in the activity that we wanted to encourage, we got more of that activity because it became reinforcing for him. Completing an activity that's hard with a peer is often a really reinforcing thing for students. And so just by pairing kids up and saying, work on this together, we can provide reinforcement for appropriate behavior, and we can also encourage more of that behavior we want to see. We also want to think about using lots of different types of rewards. So just like using lots of different types of opportunities to respond, we want to vary the type of reward that we provide. So sometimes it's a tangible thing, sometimes it's an activity, sometimes it's a privilege, sometimes it's attention from an adult or a peer, sometimes it's a natural consequence. The best way to figure out which type to use or what kids might be motivated by is to ask them. So remember to check in with your kids, ask them what are some types of things you'd like to work towards in this class. Make a list and create some systems to help them reach those different things. And check back in with them, because what is reinforcing for them at the beginning of the school year may no longer be reinforcing for them at the end of the school year. So remember, it can change across time. And just a quick reminder that we've talked about this a number of times, but the power of what we're doing here is not in the rewards. If we're relying on the rewards to motivate kids to do the right thing, we've missed the boat. We have to spend our time on those proactive, positive strategies like teaching, prompting, actively supervising, and engaging kids in instruction to prevent problem behaviors from happening. We aren't going to ever have a reinforcement system that is powerful enough to overcome all of those other things. So spend the time on the teaching side of things, not the reward side of things, but the rewards are important for just helping kids get past those difficult times. So a couple of big ideas about using reinforcement. Rather than having the intrinsic versus extrinsic reinforcement, I would encourage you to think about what's working for the kid and how can you make it more likely that the kid is able to be successful. So think about how we develop motivation to do something. If a student is not showing motivation to engage in work right now, probably they're telling you that they need a little extra dose of reinforcement, or they need you to adjust the task so it's something that they can manage. But think about, how do you provide that extra boost for them to get past those difficult times? Remember that the same student might need different levels of support in different settings or in different subjects. So we all have different strengths and weaknesses. So thinking about a student who has a good set of skills in math might need less extrinsic reinforcement in math than they do in reading. Or they might need more social support than they do academic support, or vice versa. And as they move across stages of learning, regardless of the setting they're in, so general ed, special ed, anything in between, the type of reinforcement that they're receiving and the rates of reinforcement that they're receiving should match their need, as opposed to match the setting or a particular student. The same student needs different levels of reinforcement as they move across their day, as they move across settings. And so we have to be really mindful of that as we set up a reinforcement system, that we're adjusting our levels of reinforcement depending on student need. And we'll use some data to guide that, which we'll talk about in some future modules. Remember that what's reinforcing for one student may not be for another. So think back to the function of behavior and what we really mean by reinforcement. Verbal praise from a teacher might be really reinforcing to some students. For students with a negative history with adults, that might not be reinforcing, and we might need to think about it, finding another way to acknowledge appropriate behavior for that student. So really think about how you can learn about your students, learn about their history, learn about what might be reinforcing for them, so that you can develop an acknowledgement system that meets their needs. And some reinforcement is naturally occurring, but sometimes we need a little extra to help get us over that boost. And so when you're learning something new, often that's a time when we need a little extra support and a little extra reinforcement, and that it can be faded as we get better at that particular skill. But that's really an individual process, and we need to make sure we're individualizing our use of reinforcement for students to help push them through the phases of learning. And then finally, don't forget to use a variety of different acknowledgements as you develop your acknowledgement system. So think about all of the different possible ways, from privileges to activities to attention to tangibles, that you can use to reinforce behavior. We're going to pause and ask you to respond to some of these topics that we've talked about in a discussion board. So think about, how would you describe the difference between reinforcement and rewards to a colleague? So see if you can put that in your own words. What questions or concerns do you have about the use of rewards? And use that discussion board forum as a way to get some feedback or some insight from other people that are taking this course with you, to help you really think about how we are going to apply acknowledgements in our classroom. So pause the activity, complete activity 4.1, and we'll be back in just a minute. All right, welcome back. I hope that discussion board was a useful activity for you, so that you could really get some insight on how we're going to think about using acknowledgements in the classroom. There's lots of places you can go to learn more about the effective use of reinforcers. One of those resources is linked for you here in the PowerPoint and in your workbook. It's from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. It's got some great information, so feel free to check that one out. There are also resources available at pbis.org as well.